I wanted to put both the reader and myself close to someone who's like telling you a story that you're not sure how you feel about her, you're not sure how you feel about it, and to make it to make it a kind of a gray area and to make it uncomfortable. And I mean, for me, right, since I ended up spending a whole book, writing the voice of this woman, like, you can't do that feeling like she's some kind of being in a plant, like some other species. She isn't. And that's what really, interested me. And yeah, I mean, being able to point the finger at people far away and saying you are evil, has its satisfaction, but it's sort of easy. I mean, some people are evil, but that's kind of that's easy. But what's harder is the things that tend to get a little more under the skin.
One of the things that you and I talked a bit about is that journey of class and that aspect of class.
Yeah. I mean, so she comes from kind of like like a sort of lower middle to kind of just middle class, background. And she's like a striver, and she ends up going Smith, and she's in that class position where it's like you can be okay, right? But you're not going to really get the good stuff, like the really good stuff. And she knows it, right? She knows it in the book, and she's pissed. And she's cynical in many ways. And she, and also to my mind, there's some things about which she's right. She's right. That is the way class works. Because a lot of people, it's not like I know a lot of financial criminals. I don't really know any financial criminals, like personally, exactly. But sometimes when you're with people who are quite cynical, what they'll say to you is, and it's very seductive, or it can be very seductive, they'll be like, come on, you know how it works. And they're not necessarily wrong, right? They're not necessarily wrong. Except, I mean, you then make choices from that position that I think can lead to some problematic paths. But what she sees about class is not a fantasy, and her anger is not a fantasy, and her feeling of like, I'm gonna get some for myself, definitely comes out of that kind of class, a certain kind of class resentment. And I don't think it's so hard to identify with it. And, yeah, I mean, come on, right? I mean, come on, we goop for 10 minutes. It's like, I mean, come on, we know this.
That kind of circles back a little bit to what you were talking about earlier too, about how when these major crimes are committed, and these sort of hot ticket items make their way into the public eye and are discussed in the news, the people close to the figure in question tend to be either, as the excerpt said, also seen as completely complicit, or as just non-figures sort of attached in the background. And so what the Complicities is doing is delving into the theoretical headspace of someone who is close to this ultimately a villainous kind of figure, or villainized figure. So I'm curious if you can say a little bit more about, for one thing, sort of some of the research that you have to do to get into the headspace of this kind of person and this class of people that are at the center of the book.
Well, the research, I mean, I did read a lot, and I did read a lot about like Madoff and stuff, and which is a whole other thing. And what he did is fascinating, actually. Like, sorry, this is a little bit of a digression, but you know what he did was like, it wasn't very complicated. People gave him money, he put it in a checking account. And then when other people said, oh, I want to take some money, like to buy a house or something, then he'd like take some of it out of the checking account. But he was never, nothing ever went into the stock market. They literally just had a boiler room where they invented it, where they invented like stock trade sheets. Do you know what I mean? It's so simple that it's like hilarious in a horrible way, right? That's all he did. Anyway, sorry, I digress. So yeah, so I did read a couple different books that had to do with, like financial crime and stuff like that. And like confidence, confidence games and things like that. But for a lot of it, I really did try to put myself in her shoes. And, that was horrifyingly easy to do because I have been in situations. I have been complicit with people's addictions. I have been, I'm white. I mean, come on, and not just in a sort of a category way, but it's like there are times in life when you know full well that you're getting over for one reason or another. You know it. You're coming through an airport and on your way through customs and you're not stopped and the person probably behind you is. Like, of course you know it. I mean, I'm not a financial criminal. I'd have a lot more money if I was a financial criminal. But I've been on the planet a certain amount of time, and I know all too well that queasy feeling of this isn't a great scene. I shouldn't really be here, or I shouldn't be allowed, and I'm still here, right? I'm sure that's never happened to anyone here or anyone in the Zoom situation. But it's the darkest book I've ever written. And that was actually quite hard. Like I realized it needed to be dark and that I wanted it to be dark and I wanted to kind of play through on all of this. But it was upsetting to me, honestly. It was uncomfortable. And so I'm not sure if that qualifies as research, but it's like staying with it, staying with it.
So along speaking of the research, I want to talk a little bit about the very visible elephant in the room of your book.
Yeah.
Both in terms of there's a very beautiful structure, three-part structure that's related to the whale, and then because I know that you did a great deal of research into the
I know a lot about whales.
you know a lot about whales. You've had some deep experiences, and so
yeah. So in the book, if you haven't read the book, what happens to Suzanne actually is that she's kind of flees to this small town in Massachusetts, and there's a whale stranding in the town, and that does happen in a lot of places, but it does happen on the Cape, which is where she is. And this was an element in the book from the very first moment that I thought about making it, but I didn't know anything about whales or whale strandings, and I read a lot about them. And I went and talked to some like marine mammal experts to try to learn like what happens and how it unfolds. But I couldn't. I kept on trying to get to a whale stranding, but I had a Google alert and like I begged, these women who ran this marine mammal organization out online who were incredible. And I was like, I was like, okay, so kind of like, will you just tell me when there's a stranding and I'll come? And they were like, no, you will not. Because at strandings, it's really like trained people only, for a lot of very good reasons, as I discovered. So oh my God, I mean, I looked at tons of stuff online. I looked at, I know a lot about whale decomposition now. I really, my partner and I went up to New Bedford, which is like the whaling. Moby Dick starts out in New Bedford, and we looked at all these whale skeletons, and he actually like illegally climbed up on like this plinth where there was like a vat of whale oil, and he like got me some so I could smell it, which is sorry, New Bedford Whaling Museum. And I interviewed all these people. And the whale just was like very, very, very important to me as an element in the book. But the amazing thing that happened is, so I gave up on trying to get to a whale stranding. I kept on trying. And then very, very coincidentally, my partner and I was staying at my mom's house in this beach town. She was away. And all of a sudden, in that town on that day, there was a major stranding. And we spent the next 2 days on this beach as this whale stranded and ultimately died. And it was a fin whale who weighed 20,000 pounds. He was 50 feet long, and he was as close to me as like you are, it was devastating. It was devastating. It actually was one of the more awe-inspiring and devastating experiences of my life. And I rewrote a lot of the book after that because I thought I knew what it would feel like, but I didn't know. I really did not know. And it was amazing. It was very serendipitous. It was incredible. So anyway, so I know a lot about whales now, and I know a lot about whale strandings.
On that subject, we have a question from one of our viewers.
Okay.
The whale stranding is a marvelous metaphor for overwhelming situations which can occupy a good deal of a person's life. Is that deliberate, and can you elaborate?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the whale isn't just one thing, right? The whale is lots of things, including a whale, right? Including itself. But I think it is true that actually in all my books, I am interested in scale and the way in which, as human beings, we can find ourselves in situations that are, things can happen that are too big for a human being to really understand, grasp, or come to terms with. Like, for instance, September 11th, right? I was in New York. I was living in New York on September 11th. That event, it's like it broke the frame, right? It's like a god came down and just like smashed into life, right? And among many other things about that event, the scale of it was, it's like you can't, there's a thing about the Hindenburg disaster that I've never forgotten. The big blimp that right that crashed and burned, and someone at the time who had just seen it was being interviewed, and they said, we couldn't understand it. We couldn't understand it, right? They were looking at it. They knew what it was, the blimp had crashed, right? But it's true that that for the character, the whale definitely was this, the whale is from another world. Like, they breathe underwater. One of the reasons they die when they're on land is that they collapse under their own weight. They're meant to float, right? So yeah, absolutely that. And that experience of scale, I have to say, has only increased over the past, I mean, I wrote this book long before. I was writing this book long before the pandemic ever happened. Trump ever happened, but like this idea of suddenly ordinary human life is dwarfed is something that I actually think about, or that seems to come up in my imagination a lot. Right? And it's true. I mean, when I was actually with the whale on the beach, I can't even describe. I mean, I can. I mean, like I tried, but seeing that, because he was still alive when he came up, seeing the tail of that whale go up and seeing him spout, like it. I don't even know. It blew my mind. It blew my mind, and so it's an experience of awe, right? And I think I am. It turns out I'm really interested in that scale. Yeah.
So you and I have talked a bit about sort of the way that this novel could have been a book,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
That it could have been a book in which Suzanne kind of reckons with her complicity, kind of understands her part, and she kind of finds solace and comfort with the other women in Alan, her ex-husband's Corbett, and they become a wonderful couple. But instead, you've written this book that is, to my mind, like a great unreckoning. And I wondered if you would talk a bit about that.
Yeah. It's like there's a beach novel inside this book that would probably like sell a lot more copies, and also they would make like a series out of it, and I would get like a lot of money, which would be exactly that, right? Suzanne was wrong. Oh no, she found out. I mean, there's all these movies. You see this on Netflix and stuff, like all these movies where women are married to men, and it's like, but she found out he was a confidence man. Oh, but she found out he was and then maybe he's gonna like kill her, and she has to like fight back and all this stuff, right? And I mean, there is certainly a much jollier book that I could have written that is what you described, right? And she gets in touch with his second wife and ultimately his mother. They do connect for a little while in the book. And then they all like share stories about how terrible he was, and then they set up whatever, right? And they live in nice little houses on the Cape. But I'm just not interested in that story, and also I have to say that a lot of people don't reckon; they unreckon. The thing happens, the thing falls apart, the bill comes due, and they don't do the right thing. They do the wrong thing. Or they do a bunch of kind of ham-handed things to kind of like patch it up a little bit, sort of, that doesn't really work. And I, as a writer and as a human being, I'm interested in that. I mean, if everyone really reckoned, we'd be in a much better place than we're in now. And kind of the way things unravel is really interesting to me. It's profound to me. It's moving. I think it's, in many ways, we'd all rather believe in the first story. Right? I would too.
Well, it's a story of closure.
Exactly, of closure. And I'm not so big on closure, to the good and to the bad, right? I mean, these sort of clean endings, the end of the movie, the judge Aaron Brockovich, like the gavel comes down, everybody gets paid, all this stuff. Like, I'm not sure I believe in any. I'm not sure I believe in clothing, honestly.
I think there's an interesting question there too about, and I'm curious about how much of, I mean, it seems like you have done a lot of studying of the way that people are, right? But as you're talking about unreckoning, which is a phrase I'm now in love with and will be using henceforth, I tip my invisible hat to you there. But when it comes to our cultural, well, let's talk about United Statesians, our cultural habit of unreckoning with things at the small interpersonal scale, but also at this really large scale that's being represented in the book. It's super evident that that is what we do. January 6th is a really good example. This past 4 to 6 years of certain administrations and things like that, and I wonder if you can talk a little bit about sort of like the ways that you attack that delusion of closure that you're kind of talking about. Because I'm not sure I believe in closure either, but so many people do. So like, where's the sort of cognitive dissonance coming in there, and how did you explore that?
Well, we long for closure, right? I mean, I also want the judge to like bang the gavel and make it all right. I mean, of course they do, right? Everybody does. Like we want it to be all right forever. I mean, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, like, depends on this, although of course, because it's the Marvel Cinematic Universe and you have to keep the universe going, actually there isn't closure, right? You've always got to have, like, at the very end after the credits, right? Like
ellipsis question mark.
Right. Someone comes back. I mean, in the book, the reason that closure can't happen is because the debt can't be paid, and what happens with that debt ends up excuse me, being the undoing of a lot of people for a lot of different reasons and a lot of different ways. Okay. And the whale also provided me with a kind of an amazing metaphor, which is, there's a fact about whale bones, which is that they seep oil for decades. Decades. The whale skeleton that was on the ceiling at the New Bedford Museum, the reason there was whale oil in a flask is that it was flowing from tubes from the skeleton. And that thing's been up there forever. Right, so it like seeps and seeps and seeps and seeps and seeps. So, so there's that in the book, that there's all this reverberation that can't be closed. I think that in this country, I mean, this is, I'm not the first person to say this, obviously, but this is a country of immigrants, and very, very often with people, it was like, it sucked back there, or I was whoever I was back there. Now I'm here. That's it. Leave it there, right? We're not going to reckon with that. And what we're doing here, we're not going to talk about it after, right? They just, wasn't it just last week, I think, that they found more graves from the Tulsa Massacre? Just last week. That was 100 years ago. Right? Someone knew those graves were there. It could easily be someone who's still alive. And in this country, particularly, we are particularly fond of erase it, drive on. Right? I mean, that's the Great Gatsby. I mean, that's what we like, and what we have banked on, and what is so deep in this culture, right? Erase institutional memory like as fast as you can. So, but I think that ultimately that makes people a little crazy, because we do know like literally people do know. And also on a kind of a subconscious or a demi-conscious level, there's often that feeling of like something's not right. Like something's not right here. Something feels off. But I can't put my finger on it and no one's saying it. What is that? Right? So yeah, it's very much a part of the psychological fabric of this country. I think.
There's something that Suzanne says at a certain point when she's with the whale about, she's afraid of the whale and of the immense forces all around us that we don't understand. And I feel like this is related a little bit to what we were talking about before about closure relies on us knowing everything, which is of course impossible. And that idea of these forces and the body as this kind of historical site. There's a line that runs through the book. Everybody tells a story, and I wondered if we might talk a bit about that because Alan is a body that tells a story as the product of his immense forces beyond his knowledge.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, kind of like, in a way, sort of like the whale, like it's true. Everybody does literally tell a story, right? I was at this many years ago, I was at this exhibit in London. It was called London Bodies. And they had all these like skeletons from like centuries of skeletons from people in London. And it was fascinating because things show up on your bones, right? And in fact, like all these people doing, I don't know, like the Middle Ages, right? Like the priests and the nuns, all their skeletons were really like pretty good because they got all the food. And everybody else's skeleton was like all like gnarly with like little pock marks on it, and right. I mean, literally everybody does tell a story. Everything, bones that you broke, illnesses that you had, not even like DNA stuff. I mean, like it is like an archive of what happened to you, right? All of those women in the Netherlands who starved during World War II, and their kids still have like the marks genetically from that starvation, right? So the bodies do tell these stories, right? Which very often we don't like. We try to cover up the scars, the weird places, the dented places, right? And the world too is like a huge body that tells the story. I mean, we know this. We know this. The glaciers that are melting. You can say, until you're blue in the face, you can say like climate change doesn't exist, it's not right, and then there's like, okay, but there's that mountain right there, and it doesn't have snow on it anymore. Like Kilimanjaro, I think the snow is significantly depleted. So it's like, you can say whatever you want, but there is a reality that there is an archive that is all around us that that does tell a lot of these stories. And I also think that I personally do think that we are in the midst of immense forces that we don't understand. We are. We don't know. We really do not. But it's very difficult to, it's much nicer to feel like I know where I'm going, I know what I'm doing, I know who's going to be there at the end, and straight ahead.
So I think we have time for a couple of questions from the audience, but I want to start. That's my privilege. So speaking of immense forces that we do not understand, I think that I agree with what you say there, and I think it's really powerful to acknowledge that. And I wonder if something that I've been thinking about a lot personally is that a lot of the immense forces that we do not understand have transformed over the hundreds of years and thousands of years of human history. At one point, some people thought the immense force that we didn't understand was like literally Satan bubbling up from down below and all of that stuff. Nowadays, the way that I understand these forces is that, things like capitalism, for instance, have become so outside of human control that it's its own entity that affects us. For example, or the legacy of sort of dominance and injustice, the way that human beings have just historically done that all over the world, right, to each other. Does dominance and violence, is that a force outside of our understanding and control? And I wonder, A, if you have thoughts on that, and two, if because these forces are often created by us, do you think that human beings, through creating it and being able to detect it, are more vulnerable to those forces in a way because we feel that we control them, but I don't know that we do.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, yes, I agree with you. What I actually think is that, what I think is that it's not so much that, I mean, it is that we've created a lot of our own, well, obviously a lot of our own problems, but I also think that there's something about having the humility to admit that we have these forces of darkness within us, right? I mean, I can be greedy, selfish, and mean. I'm sure no one else here can, but I personally, I will say that I can be greedy, selfish, and mean. But like anyone, right? A lot of the trouble starts when we insist that we don't have those dark forces within us, that we could never do those things, that we are, that we're always operating from a, benevolent and constructive place. I feel like that is where people can do tremendous damage, right? And I think it's sort of like respecting these forces that we all have within us, and not not acknowledging that they're there, and then not maybe like taking instructions from them. Do you know what I mean? I mean, in the same way that there's these, it's like often ways that we've like toyed with nature have been disastrous, even if they were well meant, because we didn't really understand all of the forces we were doing, right? We didn't really understand everything. What would happen if we dammed that river, that it would have these other, right? We just didn't know, right? So there's some kind of like humility and respect that I think goes for our internal worlds and for the external world, that we need to, that kind of awareness we would get a lot farther, right? Missionaries did a lot of damage in this world. We know that. But they, a lot of those people felt that they were genuinely bringing the good news, and refused to even consider the fact that that might not be all of what was going on, right? So that's kind of, that's kind of the thing.
It's an ongoing process.
Yeah.
Ongoing.
Yeah.
Thank you. Please.
Question. Yeah. So you were kind of talking about how bodies, like tell a story, and you have Suzanne, she's a masseuse, like kind of figuring out these stories of the body work she's doing. And those are things that like can only be discovered through physical touch.
Yeah.
But there are other spots in the novel where it's like so visually glaring that there are issues of like decay. And I'm kind of thinking of the structures of like the whale body, as it's going through that decay process. I think there's a point where you describe it almost like cathedral,
Yeah.
the bones.
Yeah.
And then I saw a parallel with the spec house and how it
Yeah.
was unbuilt. And so you have like the
Yeah.
bones of this house versus the bones of the whale.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering if you could speak to the parallels that were there.
Yeah. Well, in both those cases, right? Like Suzanne is really connected. You know, she keeps going back to look at the whale body as it's decomposing, and she goes finally to the spec house and walks through. And in a lot of those scenes, she's looking at something that is telling a story very loudly, and she doesn't entirely want to get with the story that she's that it's telling. Do you know what I mean? Like, she's very attracted to it. She keeps going back there with the whale, but what it's saying is, or part of what it's saying is, like, she doesn't entirely want to deal with it, right? And with the spec house, when she goes, I mean, I won't like go into it for anyone who hasn't read the book, but at first when she goes through it, it's like, where am I? And then she realizes what she's walking through, and you know, it's sort of horrible, right? It's kind of tragic for her, which to me is like, you know, it's not just her. I feel like it's all of us. It's like we're right in the middle of it. Our faces are like smashed in it, and we're like, what does this mean? It's like, well, you know what it means, right? I mean, it means many things, but that thing of like, I'm going to keep looking and looking and looking to say and not say what I'm looking at, right? And these physical structures are really great at, you know, I just think they make good scenes. Like, you can, it just works for me. Like, you can literally be standing in it, and you know, what is this? So that was, you know, that was kind of things fall apart.
Well, it's interesting too, because they're like cathedrals, but,
Yeah.
but also husks.
Yeah.
Right. So yeah, we have kind of
Yeah.
simultaneous like grandeur and
Yeah.
decay.
Yeah. Yeah.
In the course of your research about financial crime, what was the thing you discovered that was the most strange?
Most interesting. Well, partly it's what I said, which is sometimes, you know, we like to think that these are like some very, like they're doing some very special, super secret, arcane thing, but a lot of the time they're really not. I mean, the subprime mortgage, I mean, you know, this doesn't require you. It can require a lot of fancy footwork to hide it. It doesn't necessarily require that much fancy footwork to do it, right? And I mean, the odd thing about the Madoffs is that they actually live very fairly modestly. They were very unostentatious in a kind of, which was very interesting to me. But also, you know, the thing about financial crime, there was actually a big article in the New Yorker about a year ago about a support group for former financial criminals. And they weren't so big on the kind of making amends situation. You know, it was more like, boo-hoo, we got caught. It's a lot of those people, they don't reckon. I'm not sure if it's from being rich, or if it is the somewhat alienated nature of the crime, but there's really some slippery thinking going on that they, you know, I mean, with Enron, you know, the subtitle of that documentary was "The Smartest Guys in the Room," or I guess it was the book, right? And they were just like, here's the system, I can game it. And also when you, I mean, I'm not speaking about something I really know a lot about, okay, but just when you get into some of these financial instruments and some of this other stuff, you are getting into math, and there is manipulating currency. There is stuff with currencies and exchange rates where you're sort of making bets, And the stock market is making bets. I mean, that's what it is, right? So there are these really interesting, I would have to know more than I do, but there are these other really interesting gray areas where it's like, well, at what point does the SEC get involved here? Because it's all this, right? So really, that really interested me and surprised me. Yeah, there's not a huge amount of remorse in what I've seen. I'm not, like I said, I'm not an expert, but not a lot of remorse. I mean, in that way though, how much true remorse have you seen at the January 6th meetings? I mean, there was a lot of hours of tape, and maybe some of those people did feel remorseful, but it's like, show me the part where Ivanka Trump says to the man who got slammed in the head with a fire extinguisher, I feel that I was in some way responsible for this. I see a lot of people saying, well, I tried to tell him, I was, I spoke up, no one was listening to me. I haven't heard a lot of, I felt sick when I realized what I had participated in creating, right? So I don't know, it may have to do with being a criminal, I don't know.
So again, when we were talking about like closure and unreckoning, there was a part where Suzanne runs into the people from her past life on the street and judge them, and they call her by like her husband's last name, and she's like calling at their backs, like, I go by Susan Clardy, that's not my name, that's not my name. And then at the end, in the epilogue, it's, you have her so that she's going by Lena.
Yeah,
and so you kind of have like, before, I'm thinking of when she's the masseuse, when she's operating legally, and then she gets this license and she's going by a different name. And I'm wondering if that's more about like still that unreckoning and that distance from like the past, or if it's like, she does get the license and she's operating legally. So if it's like trying to take on like a different reclaimed identity, or if it can be like kind of both of those.
Yeah, definitely both of those, but definitely like she wants to say, I'm not that, right? I mean, I've said this before, but somewhere, and if I was a better person, I would find it, but somewhere, Harvey Weinstein, he said, I'm not that guy. And it's like, no, you're exactly that guy. You're like the epitome of that guy. You're the worst example of that guy ever, right? But to him, and I do find this fascinating, he's like, no, I'm not that guy. And I think that, in a much, a different register on a smaller scale, but she's like, she has this kind of a feeling of a malleability, right? I'm not that. Well, I divorced him, so that's over. I'm not her anymore, right? Well, all right, I finally got the real license, and now at the spa, I'll call myself Lumen, right? Right. So there's this belief in her that you can just kind of sail on to the next thing, right? And so yeah, definitely.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining us tonight. This was incredible. If you have not yet gotten your copy of the book, please feel free to grab it now. This is your time to mingle and chat for the next 9 minutes.